Did you know that a simple invention during WW2 changed the course of battles, but the enemy had no clue about it? And today, I'm going to tell you the shocking secret that turned the tide in favor of the Allies. Hey there! Welcome back to the channel. If you love stories from history that you've never heard before, then you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into a hidden gem from World War II that could have made a world of difference for the German army if only they knew about it. We're talking about the Sherman tank and the game-changing secret weapon it carried, the most advanced radios of the time. Let's rewind time and uncover how this piece of technology flipped the script on the battlefield. Imagine being in a battle. You're inside a tank, surrounded by the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Your mission is clear: destroy the enemy and help your comrades win. But there's one problem. You can't talk to anyone. The only way you can communicate with the outside world is by shouting, using hand signals, or waiting for orders from your commanders who are miles away. Sounds difficult, right? Now, think about the American soldiers during World War II. They didn't have to worry about communication because their tanks, the Sherman tanks, were equipped with something that the enemy had never seen before, something that would change everything. The most advanced radio technology in the world at that time. This tiny piece of equipment became a game changer, making all the difference in battle. The radio advantage. To understand how big this was, let's take a step back and look at the situation in 1944. The American military had already been using advanced communication equipment, including radios, for years. But what made the Sherman tank stand out wasn't just its firepower or speed. It was the fact that these tanks were the first to be equipped with a radio system that could reach all the way from one tank to another, from a tank to artillery, and even from the ground to aircraft in the sky. This allowed American soldiers to stay in constant contact with each other, no matter how far apart they were. Now, why was this so important? Let's break it down. In any battle, communication is crucial. Imagine trying to organize a team to do anything, whether it's a sport or a work project. If you can't communicate with your team members, it's nearly impossible to get anything done. It's the same in war. In fact, without communication, soldiers would be isolated and confused. The radio allowed the Americans to communicate instantly with their entire force. They could make decisions in real time, adjusting their strategies based on new information from different parts of the battlefield. If a tank was under attack, the commander could immediately call for backup. If they spotted an enemy position, they could alert their comrades and coordinate a plan to take it down. On the other hand, the German forces, who were also using tanks in battle, had radios, but they weren't nearly as effective. The radios in their tanks were often unreliable, with limited range and poor signal quality. This meant that when their tanks entered battle, the German commanders and crews struggled to communicate. They didn't have the advantage of being able to share vital information instantly. Let's think about what it would be like for the German soldiers in this situation. They would be on the battlefield, trying to move their tanks into the right position while keeping an eye on the enemy. But imagine that they can't talk to anyone else except by shouting or using hand signals. If they wanted to request air support or artillery strikes, they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way, by sending runners or waiting for orders from a higher command, which could take hours. In a battle, those hours could be the difference between winning and losing. American forces, on the other hand, had a system that could adapt quickly. They were able to respond to changes on the battlefield almost immediately, making their forces much more flexible and harder to outmaneuver. Real-time decision making. Think about this. During the D-Day invasion, American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy with the mission of pushing inland and defeating the German forces. What made this operation successful wasn't just the sheer number of troops or the surprise factor. It was the ability to communicate quickly, get real-time updates, and adjust strategies accordingly. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, were able to communicate with other tanks, artillery units, and even planes in the air. If enemy forces moved into a certain area, tanks could immediately change their position to counter them. The radios helped coordinate ground attacks and airstrikes. It was a well-oiled machine where every part worked together. thanks to the radio. German tanks, on the other hand, didn't have this advantage. Their tanks could be stationed far from each other, and with poor communication systems, it was harder for them to launch coordinated attacks. If a German commander wanted to call for reinforcements, it could take too long, and by that time, the Americans would already be in a new position, ready to strike. Here's something the German forces didn't know. While they were battling hard, they didn't realize that the Sherman tanks they were facing had a hidden advantage. They assumed that the reason the American tanks were so successful was because of their firepower or their numbers. What they didn't know was that the real secret weapon was the communication network built into each tank. The German forces, even though they were highly skilled and had some of the most powerful tanks like the Tiger tank, couldn't match the level of coordination that the Americans had. This wasn't just a matter of better weapons or tactics, it was about having the ability to talk to each other when it counted. Imagine this. The Germans could fire a few shots at an American tank, but if they couldn't see where the other American tanks were, they were at a serious disadvantage. The Sherman tanks could move in packs, using their radios to warn each other of incoming threats, call for air support, or ask for backup. In essence, the Americans were communicating so well that they could almost anticipate what the enemy would do next. The Sherman tank's radio system was groundbreaking. It wasn't just about sending messages back and forth. It allowed tanks to connect with other military units in real time. This kind of communication was essential during the battles in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and other key moments in the European theater. For the German forces, the advantage of real-time communication would have been a game-changer. With their unreliable radios, they were at a disadvantage from the start. They couldn't make decisions quickly enough, couldn't adapt to changes in the battle, and ultimately couldn't keep up with the Allied forces. One of the most interesting parts of this story is that the Germans never knew about the true advantage of the Sherman tanks. They saw the tanks and thought that it was simply their firepower and numbers that made the Americans so successful. What they didn't realize was that the Americans were able to stay organized, keep moving forward, and communicate instantly, all thanks to their radios. Even when the Germans faced off against the Sherman tanks in battle, they had no idea what they were up against. The Allies' ability to communicate in real time allowed them to outmaneuver and outsmart the German forces. It wasn't just about fighting with tanks or guns. It was about having a way to talk to your comrades when it mattered most. At the end of the day, war is about information. The side that can gather, process, and act on information quickly is the side that has the advantage. This is what made the Sherman tank so deadly in battle. While the Germans were focused on physical strength, the Americans understood that communication was key to success. So, why didn't the Germans catch on? Why didn't they figure out that the Sherman's advantage was in its radio system? That's a question for another time. But what we do know is that the power of communication is what made all the difference. Think about it. If you were stuck in a battle without the ability to communicate, how long do you think you'd last? In war, communication can mean life or death. The Sherman tanks understood this better than anyone else, and it was this simple yet powerful tool, the radio, that helped the Allies win. But here's the question. If the Germans had known about the power of the Sherman's radios, would the outcome of some battles have been different? Could they have turned the tide of the war with better communication? It's a question that remains unanswered, but one thing is for sure. Communication changed the course of history. Imagine you're a German tank commander in 1944, facing off against the infamous American Sherman tanks. You've heard rumors that these tanks are everywhere, advancing through France and causing havoc. But you don't know why. Is it because of their powerful weapons? Or is there something more? You might have been wondering, what made the Sherman tank so effective? Was it its firepower? Its speed? Or was there something else that the Germans never even knew about? The secret, the hidden advantage, was the Sherman tank's radio system. But what if the German forces had discovered this secret early on? How different would the battles have been? Could the Germans have adapted to the Americans' superior communication? Let's explore how this little-known advantage changed the game. The Sherman tank. More than just a tank. When you think of a tank, what comes to mind? Massive armor, big guns, and heavy firepower, right? Well, the Sherman tank had all of that, but it wasn't the only thing that made it so formidable. The real secret behind its success was its communication system. The Sherman tank's radio allowed the Americans to coordinate attacks, share information, and move in sync with each other. The Germans, however, didn't have the same advantage. Their tanks were still equipped with outdated radios, limiting their ability to react to changing battlefield conditions. If the Germans had known about the Sherman's advanced radio communication, it would have shaken their entire strategy. Why? Because they were fighting a war on multiple fronts, and being able to coordinate quickly could have meant the difference between victory and defeat. The German perspective. The missed opportunity. Now, let's think about the Germans. They were tough fighters. They had highly skilled tank crews, like those driving the powerful Tiger tanks. These tanks were known for their firepower and armor. But the problem was that the Germans never knew that the Americans had an even more powerful weapon, an invisible one. The German forces were used to relying on their physical might. They had impressive tanks and artillery, and they believed that whoever had the better tank would win. What they didn't understand was that the true advantage was in communication, and the Shermans had that advantage in spades. For the Germans, even the best tank in the world wouldn't be enough if it couldn't talk to the rest of the army in real time. When American commanders issued orders, they could quickly pass on those orders through the radio. They could adapt to changes instantly. They could move in new directions, bring in air support, and call for reinforcements, all because of their network of radios. But the Germans? They were still trying to pass messages through runners or rely on outdated communication methods, which could take time, precious time that they didn't have. So what would have happened if the Germans had known about this? Radio advantage? A different kind of battle. The coordination edge. The Sherman tank wasn't just a fighting machine, it was part of a larger network of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. This network allowed the Americans to stay flexible on the battlefield. When something changed, like an enemy ambush or a surprise attack, the Americans could respond immediately. Let's take the famous D-Day invasion as an example. As American forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, they faced fierce German resistance. But the Sherman tanks could communicate directly with the infantry and support artillery units, guiding them through obstacles and coordinating their efforts. The German tanks, by contrast, struggled to coordinate with one another. If one unit got stuck or encountered an obstacle, the others didn't know where to go or what was happening. What if the Germans had the same communication system? Would they have been able to outmaneuver the Americans? Would they have been able to coordinate attacks better and disrupt the Allied forces more effectively? The answer is probably yes. If the Germans had known the true power of the Sherman's radios, they could have developed counter-strategies and adapted to the evolving battlefield more quickly. The tactical disadvantage. Blind and uncoordinated. Imagine being a German tank commander during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. You're deep behind enemy lines, and the Americans are pushing forward. The weather is terrible, the terrain is difficult, and communication is practically impossible. Now imagine if you could instantly talk to the tanks around you and share information with your fellow soldiers on the ground. Imagine being able to call for air support or artillery fire with just the push of a button. It could make all the difference. Instead, German commanders had to rely on slower methods, like runners and written orders, which meant that critical information took too long to arrive at the right places. By the time the information reached the front line, it was often too late to make an effective change. The Sherman tank's radio system allowed the Americans to stay one step ahead. They knew where the Germans were, what they were doing, and how to counter their movements. But the Germans, lacking the same communication power, were essentially flying blind. Every time they tried to move forward, the Americans were already prepared. They knew what the Germans were up to before the Germans even knew where the Americans were coming from. The missed advantage. Could it have changed the outcome? So what would have happened if the Germans had realized the power of the Sherman tank's communication system? Let's think about the Battle of Normandy. The Americans landed on D-Day with thousands of tanks, infantry, and aircraft. But it wasn't just their numbers that won the battle. It was their ability to coordinate their forces through constant communication. If the Germans had had that same ability, they might have been able to regroup, reorganize, and launch counterattacks. They could have used their Tiger tanks more effectively by calling for support, flanking American positions, and hitting weaker targets. Imagine a scenario where the Germans were able to react quickly to American maneuvers, pushing the Allies back. Could they have retaken some of the ground they lost? Could they have delayed the Allies' progress? The war was already turning against them by the time they realized the importance of good communication. But this insight might have given them just enough time to slow down the Allies and potentially cause more chaos on the battlefield. The importance of adaptation. What the German forces failed to realize was that communication wasn't just an advantage. It was the key to survival in modern warfare. Tanks were no longer just machines of brute force. They were part of a system. This system had to be coordinated, and that's where the Sherman tank's radio came into play. Had the Germans figured out how to match or counter this advantage, it could have changed their entire approach. Their tanks could have become more flexible, their troops more coordinated, and their ability to react to threats faster. The war could have looked very different, especially in the critical moments when American forces were pressing forward into Germany. The hidden secret of the Sherman tank. The truth is, the Sherman tank's radio system was underestimated by the Germans. They thought it was just another tank, another piece of American machinery that could be destroyed with the right tactics. But the radio was the real weapon. It allowed American forces to stay organized, work together, and adapt to anything the Germans threw at them. In hindsight, the Germans probably didn't realize how much of an edge they were giving up by not having a similar communication system. The Sherman tanks weren't just fighting machines. They were wires, signals, and a network of tanks working together as one. The Germans missed this completely. What if the Germans had known? So let's ask the big question again. What if the Germans had known about the Sherman tank's radio advantage? Could they have adapted in time to turn the tide of battle? Could they have used better communication to fight back against the Allies' superior coordination? We'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain. The Sherman's advantage was not in its armor or firepower. It was in its ability to communicate. And that made all the difference in the world. Picture this. You're a German officer stationed on the front lines of World War II, preparing to engage the enemy. You know the American forces are pushing hard against your defenses, but you've got a plan. You've studied the maps, you know your tank's capabilities, and you're confident that with superior firepower, you can overpower them. But then something happens. Something you don't expect. Your tanks, your artillery, and your infantry aren't able to coordinate. They're isolated and you can't get real-time updates. The Americans, on the other hand, seem to be everywhere, coordinating their attacks, making rapid moves, and staying one step ahead. What you don't know, what you couldn't possibly know, is that the American Sherman tanks are armed with a hidden weapon, radio communication. And it's that very weapon that's allowing them to outmaneuver and outsmart you. The German perspective, overpowered and out of sync at this point in the war, the Germans had already lost much of their early momentum. They were fighting a two-front war, stretched thin across Europe and the Soviet Union. But they still had powerful tanks, like the infamous WWII, which was feared for its heavy armor and devastating cannon. The Germans believed that their firepower and armor would win them the battle. But there was a problem. Despite having superior tanks, they were fighting blind. The Germans didn't have the advanced communication systems the Allies had, and it was starting to show. Their tanks were isolated, unable to effectively communicate with each other in the heat of battle. Commanders couldn't coordinate quickly enough, and the units were scattered across the battlefield, often unaware of each other's movements. This lack of coordination meant that even though they had the superior tank in terms of firepower, They couldn't take advantage of their strengths. The Sherman tanks, equipped with the ability to communicate instantly, were able to respond, adapt, and overpower them. The key advantage: instant communication. The key to understanding this situation is realizing that communication in battle is everything. It's not just about having the best weapons. It's about having the ability to talk to your team and share information. The Sherman tanks were equipped with radios that allowed them to stay in constant contact with commanders, infantry, artillery, and even aircraft. In contrast, the German tanks were often stuck with outdated communication systems, or worse, no communication at all. The Americans had developed a network that connected everyone on the battlefield. If a tank was under attack, it could immediately send a signal for help. If infantry needed support, they could contact the tanks for backup. If there was a new enemy position discovered, the information was passed along quickly, allowing the Americans to adapt their strategy in real time. For the Germans, though, this was an entirely different story. Their tanks lacked the same sophisticated communication systems, making it harder for them to coordinate effectively. In a fast-moving battle, it wasn't just the guns and armor that counted. It was the ability to talk to your forces, to call for backup, to reorganize your troops on the fly. And this was something the Germans simply didn't have. The American advantage: coordination, not just firepower. The Sherman's radio system wasn't just a fancy piece of equipment. It was the key to success in modern warfare. It allowed tanks to work together, share vital information, and adjust plans quickly. While German tanks were still relying on outdated systems, the Sherman tanks were already engaging in real-time strategy, making them far more adaptable in the chaos of battle. Think about the Battle of the Bulge, for example. It was one of the last major German offensives on the Western Front. The Germans launched a surprise attack, hoping to break through the Allied lines. But the Americans, equipped with their communication networks, quickly adapted. The Shermans moved into position, coordinated with artillery and air support, and used their radios to stay in touch with each other. The German tanks, however, were scattered and unable to keep track of the movements of their own forces. They couldn't communicate across long distances, meaning that they were easily isolated. If a German tank was ambushed or outflanked, it took time for the rest of the forces to react. In a fast-paced battle, that was enough to give the Americans the upper hand. What the Germans didn't know: the hidden weapon. Now let's rewind to that critical moment. The Germans are on the battlefield, facing the Shermans, but they don't know the full truth. They see the Allied tanks moving and engaging, but they don't realize what's making them so effective. They didn't know that the Sherman tanks were working together, connected by their radios, organizing their attacks in real time. To them, the Americans just seemed faster, more coordinated, and too powerful to handle. But it wasn't their firepower or the size of their forces. The real reason the Sherman tanks were so successful was that they had instant communication. This advantage was hidden in plain sight, and the Germans never figured it out. The Germans, locked in their battle for survival, didn't understand that it wasn't just the strength of the tanks that mattered. It was the system that made them so powerful: the ability to communicate, share intelligence, and adapt. This blind spot meant that the Germans were fighting at a serious disadvantage, without realizing it. The hidden impact of the blind side. What might have happened if the Germans had known about the Sherman's radio advantage? Could they have turned the tide in certain battles? It's possible. If they had realized that the Americans were not just attacking with tanks, but with a well-coordinated network, they might have adjusted their tactics to counteract it. Imagine if the German commanders had been able to quickly understand where the Sherman tanks were at all times and how they were communicating across the battlefield. Could they have disrupted the American coordination? Could they have used their superior tanks more effectively by coordinating their movements? The answer is unclear, but one thing is certain. The radio communication advantage was a massive blindside for the Germans. It was an advantage they never saw coming, and by the time they figured it out, it was too late. The importance of information in war at the end of the day. The blind side of the Germans wasn't about their ability to fight. It was about their lack of information. In war, information is power, and the Sherman tanks were armed with more than just weapons. They were armed with the ability to share vital information instantly. While the Germans were still relying on outdated methods to communicate, the Americans had already figured out the key to modern warfare: the ability to talk to your soldiers and adapt your strategy in real time. The Germans, for all their skill and power, simply couldn't keep up. So as the Germans continued to face the relentless push of the Allies, they remained in the dark about the true reason for their struggles. They were fighting blind, and the Sherman tanks, with their hidden radio advantage, were the reason the Allies were able to stay ahead. The year is 1944. The Allies have launched their D-Day invasion, and American forces are pushing deeper into German-occupied Europe. The Germans, already stretched thin and on the defensive, are struggling to keep up with the speed of the Allied advance. Their tanks, once feared for their firepower and armor, are now bogged down in a war of attrition, unable to respond quickly enough to the rapidly changing conditions of the battlefield. But there's something the Germans still don't know. The Allies' success is not just due to superior tanks or numbers, but because of a crucial advantage that the Germans have completely overlooked: the ability to communicate. As the war enters its final phase, this hidden advantage would be the turning point that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. The D-Day invasion, an example of superior coordination. Let's start with D-Day. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was a turning point in World War II. The operation was carefully planned and executed by the Allies, but the real success came from communication and coordination. As thousands of American soldiers, tanks, and aircraft landed on the beaches of Normandy, it wasn't just their sheer numbers that overwhelmed the Germans. It was their ability to organize their forces in real time. The Sherman tanks, equipped with advanced radio systems, were able to communicate with each other and their commanders, coordinating attacks with infantry and artillery. They were part of a much larger network of forces that could respond quickly and adjust strategies as needed. American forces didn't just arrive in Normandy and begin a random assault. They worked together, sharing information about enemy positions, artillery fire, and air support. The German forces, in contrast, were overwhelmed and unable to react quickly. The weather, the terrain, and their outdated communication systems hampered their ability to coordinate an effective defense. Even though they had strong defensive positions and elite units, they were forced to fight blind against the coordinated American assault. If the Germans had had the same communication systems, they might have been able to call in reinforcements faster, adjust their defense strategies more effectively, and counterattack in a more organized manner. But they didn't. And that's the key to understanding the turning point. Communication made the Allies more flexible and responsive to battlefield changes. It gave them the ability to outmaneuver the Germans and press forward, no matter how intense the opposition. The Battle of the Bulge, the final test. The real test of the Sherman's communication advantage came later, in December 1944, with the Battle of the Bulge. This was the last major German offensive against the Allies, and it was their attempt to break through the American lines in Belgium. The Germans had hoped to split the American and British forces, encircle them, and create chaos on the Western Front. For the Germans, this was a make-or-break moment. They had a small window of opportunity to gain ground and break the Allied line. They pushed hard, hoping to surprise the Americans and create confusion. The Sherman tanks, however, were ready. Thanks to their radios, American forces knew where the Germans were moving, and they could coordinate a quick counterattack. In the midst of the battle, American commanders used their radios to issue orders, direct artillery fire, and call in air support. Tanks, infantry, and artillery worked in sync, adapting to new information as it came in. This instant communication was the deciding factor in the battle. Even though the Germans had launched a fierce offensive, the Americans were able to respond rapidly, keeping the Germans on the defensive. The turning point in the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just the arrival of reinforcements. It was the fact that the Americans could organize and communicate quickly. German forces, meanwhile, couldn't adjust their tactics fast enough because they were fighting without the advantage of real-time communication. Despite heavy casualties, The Allied forces were able to repel the German offensive, and the battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany on the Western Front. The Sherman tanks' radios played a major role in this success. They allowed the Americans to stay one step ahead of the Germans, organizing their forces and responding to changes faster than the Germans could. A critical missed opportunity for the Germans by the time of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had begun to understand that their traditional methods were no longer enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and unable to adapt to the changing nature of modern warfare. The Germans had powerful tanks like the Tiger and Panther, but they lacked the ability to coordinate them effectively. The Allies, on the other hand, had a clear advantage not just in firepower, but in how they used their firepower. If the Germans had recognized the importance of communication systems earlier in the war, they might have been able to keep up with the Allies' advances. They might have been able to counter the Allies' strategies with their own synchronized forces. But instead, the German tanks fought in isolation, unable to adapt quickly or coordinate with one another. The Sherman tank's radio system allowed the Allies to stay organized even in the chaos of battle. It gave them the ability to coordinate surprise attacks, counter German moves, and execute complex maneuvers without missing a beat. The Germans simply didn't have the ability to do the same, and by the time they realized it, the war had already turned against them. The final blow. The collapse of Nazi Germany. As the war progressed, the Germans continued to struggle with their communication issues. Even as they fought bravely and deployed their best soldiers, they were outclassed by the Allies' ability to work as a cohesive force. The sheer power of radio communication meant that the Americans could act as a unified force, making quick decisions and rapidly adjusting their plans on the battlefield. Eventually, the Allies' coordinated efforts led to the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Germans, unable to break through the Allied defenses and unable to communicate effectively, were pushed back at every turn. In the spring of 1945, American and Soviet forces entered Berlin, marking the end of the war in Europe. While the Germans fought bravely to the end, it was the Allies' communication advantage that allowed them to outmaneuver and defeat them. The Sherman tanks, with their ability to communicate instantly, became the symbol of Allied success. It wasn't just their firepower that mattered. It was the ability to communicate and coordinate that made all the difference. The legacy of the Sherman's advantage, the impact of the Sherman tank's radio system, cannot be overstated. It wasn't just a tank. It was a mobile communication hub, and it allowed the Allies to win battles that might otherwise have been lost. As history shows, wars are not only won by the strongest armies, but by the armies that can adapt, coordinate, and communicate the fastest. The Sherman tanks, equipped with their cutting-edge radios, were able to do just that. The turning point in World War II wasn't just a single battle or a single moment. It was the realization that communication was the key to success. The Germans, who underestimated this fact, were left struggling to keep up, while the Allies surged forward, more united than ever. The Sherman tanks' radios didn't just change the course of a few battles. They helped change the course of the entire war. And that's why the radio systems aboard these tanks were one of the most important factors in the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany. The year is 1945. The war in Europe is nearing its end. The Germans, once a powerful force, are now cornered. Their tanks are still formidable, but they're isolated and inefficient. The Allies, on the other hand, are moving relentlessly forward, fueled not just by sheer strength, but by their ability to communicate, the one advantage that turned the tide in their favor. As the Allies push deeper into German territory, the final blow is about to be dealt. The Sherman tanks, with their unmatched communication capabilities, are at the forefront of this decisive moment. It's no longer just about firepower. The ability to coordinate, adapt, and respond quickly is what sets the Allies apart from the exhausted and disorganized German forces. And this advantage, which the Germans never fully understood, will lead to the collapse of the Third Reich. The collapse of the German front by early 1945. The Germans were overwhelmed on both fronts. The Soviets were pushing from the east, and the Allies were advancing from the west. The Sherman tanks were leading the charge on the Western Front, and their radio systems were crucial in coordinating the final push. Imagine a German commander, sitting in his tank, watching as American forces continue to advance. He knows his position is becoming more and more precarious, but he has no way of coordinating an effective defense. His forces are scattered, communications are poor, and the Allies are everywhere. The Germans, for all their valor, are outnumbered, outgunned, and most importantly, outcoordinated. And here's the kicker. They still don't realize what gave the Allies this edge. While the Germans are fighting isolated battles, the Allies, with their Sherman tanks equipped with advanced radios, are moving as a unified force. The ability to communicate and adjust their tactics on the fly makes them impossible to stop. Every time the Germans think they've gained an advantage, the Allies are already repositioning, calling in air support, or sending reinforcements, all because their tanks, artillery, and infantry are connected through a single network of communication. The Allies' final push into Berlin as the war reaches its final stages. The Americans and their allies are closing in on Berlin, the heart of the Nazi regime. The Sherman tanks, with their unparalleled ability to communicate, are crucial in the final assault. Every move, every strategy is planned and executed in real time. Commanders can issue orders, receive intelligence, and coordinate efforts across thousands of miles, something the Germans simply can't do. In contrast, the German defenses are faltering. The German tanks, like the mighty Tiger and Panther, are still powerful, but they are out of sync. A German commander might issue an order for an attack, but without a reliable way to communicate with his forces, it takes too long for the rest of the units to act. By the time a response is given, the Americans are already moving in new directions, ready to strike. This lack of communication is not just frustrating for the German soldiers, it's deadly. The Sherman tanks don't need to wait for orders. They move together, in perfect coordination, ready to counter any German action before it even happens. The Germans, despite their best efforts, are left blind, unable to mount an effective defense against the Allied assault. The final blow. The fall of Berlin by April 1945. Berlin is surrounded. The Soviet army is pushing from the east, and the Allies are closing in from the west. The German resistance is collapsing, and their tanks, still formidable in terms of firepower, can no longer keep up. Their lines are broken. Their communication is in shambles. And most importantly, they no longer have the cohesive force that could match the speed and precision of the Allies. The Sherman tanks, now fully integrated into the Allied push, are leading the final charge. Their radios allow for real-time communication across vast distances. As American soldiers enter the streets of Berlin, they are able to call in airstrikes, artillery support, and adjust their tactics instantly. They don't have to wait for information to come in through slow or unreliable channels. They already know what's happening, and they're acting immediately. In Berlin, the final stand of the Nazi forces becomes a desperate attempt to hold back the inevitable. The Sherman tanks and their superior communication systems are key to dismantling what's left of the German resistance, and as the Allies march toward the heart of the German capital, they are met with little resistance. The German army has already been crippled by its inability to adapt, to communicate, and to coordinate. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrenders. The Allies are victorious. The legacy of the Sherman's communication advantage. In the aftermath of the war, as history looks back at the causes of the Allies' victory, one factor stands out: the power of communication. While the Germans relied on tanks and weapons, the Allies recognized that war in the modern age was about coordinating and communicating. The Sherman tanks were not just a symbol of firepower, but of how technology could change the way wars were fought. The radio systems in these tanks allowed the Allies to maintain a level of coordination and adaptability that the Germans simply couldn't match. And this was the ultimate deciding factor. While the German tanks were powerful, they were isolated. They couldn't adjust to the battlefield as quickly. They couldn't stay connected. They couldn't communicate effectively. And this, in the end, was what gave the Allies the final victory. Final thought. Could it have been different? As we look back at the war, we are left with an important question. What if the Germans had understood the importance of communication earlier? What if they had equipped their tanks with the same radio systems as the Americans? Could they have stayed in the fight longer, or even turned the tide in their favor? We'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. The Sherman tank's radio advantage was the key to the Allied victory. It wasn't just about the power of the tanks themselves. It was about how they worked together and could adapt to anything the Germans threw at them. The final blow to Nazi Germany wasn't just delivered by tanks, bombs, or guns. It was delivered by a communication system that tied together the Allied forces and gave them the power to outmaneuver, outsmart, and overwhelm the Germans. But here's where it gets interesting. The full story behind the Sherman tank's radios isn't as simple as it seems. In fact, there was a twist that no one saw coming: ending and call to action. Now that you know how the Sherman's advanced radios changed the course of history, I'll leave you with this thought. What would have happened if the Germans had cracked the code earlier? Could they have turned the war in their favor? If you're intrigued by hidden stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And hey, let me know in the comments. What era of history do you want me to dive into next? I'll see you in the next video, where we uncover even more shocking secrets.